didn't find out the truth in a dramatic way. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no moment where everything shattered all at once. It came to me the way real betrayal often does in a woman's life, quietly, deliberately, almost politely. My name is Alina Whitman. I am 62 years old, and until recently I believed I had lived an honest life built on effort, patience, and sacrifice. I believed that if you showed up every day, paid your dues, stayed loyal, and kept your promises, life would eventually meet you halfway. That belief shaped everything I did. I married young, stayed married when it wasn't easy, worked 2 decades in the same administrative job, raised children who grew up and moved away, and learned how to make myself smaller so others could feel more comfortable. I wasn't weak. I was dependable. And that, I later learned, is exactly why they chose me. On the morning everything changed, I was standing in my kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, holding a stack of mail I hadn't bothered opening the day before. The house was quiet in the way it always was now. No children, no urgency, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of my husband moving around upstairs. I remember noticing how ordinary everything felt, how safe it all seemed. That's the cruelest part of betrayal. It never announces itself. It waits until you're calm enough to be careless. One envelope in particular caught my attention, not because it looked important, but because it was addressed to a name I didn't recognize yet carried my home address. I opened it without suspicion, without fear, without any instinct to protect myself. And as I read the first few lines, something inside me didn't break. It went very still. The letter wasn't meant for me. That much was clear. It was a confirmation, numbers, dates. Legal language. Assets being discussed casually, confidently, as if the outcome was already decided. As if my life, my marriage, my home were background details rather than the center of the story. I read it twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe how calmly it spoke about a future I wasn't included in. In that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage. What I felt was something far more dangerous, a deep, slow realization that the people closest to me had already moved on without telling me, that they had made plans that required my silence, my age, and my assumed compliance. I thought back to all the times I'd been told, "You don't need to worry about that," or "I'll handle it," or "It's complicated, Alina, you wouldn't want to deal with it." I had accepted those words as care, as protection. I now understood they were preparation. Preparation for the moment when I would be too tired, too old, or too unsure of myself to fight back. And here is the truth most people don't like to say out loud. Betrayal hurts more when it comes after a lifetime of doing the right thing. Because you don't just lose trust, you lose the version of yourself that believed integrity guaranteed safety. As I stood there in my kitchen, the letter trembling slightly in my hand, I realized this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. And the reason it worked for so long was because they believed I would react the way women like me are expected to react, with confusion, with fear, with a desire to keep the peace. But something inside me shifted at that exact moment. Not loudly, not emotionally. It was the quiet decision of a woman who finally understands that being kind does not mean being blind, and being patient does not mean being powerless. And before we go any further, let me ask you this. Have you ever been so loyal that people assumed you would never stand up for yourself? If you have, then you already know what happens next isn't revenge in the way movies show it. It's something slower, smarter, and impossible to stop once it begins. The first thing I did after folding that letter back into its envelope was confront anyone or start asking questions. I made coffee. That detail matters because it tells you exactly what kind of woman I was, and what kind of woman they thought I still was. I had spent decades responding to discomfort by maintaining routine, by proving to myself that nothing could shake me enough to stop functioning. So I stood there, waiting for the machine to finish brewing, listening to the familiar drip, 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 while my mind replayed every conversation from the last 5 years with a new clarity that was almost painful. Suddenly, all those moments I'd brushed aside as minor didn't look minor anymore. They lined up neatly, like pieces of a puzzle I'd never bothered to assemble. My husband, Richard, insisting on handling the financial side of things once I turned 60. My sister-in-law's casual jokes about downsizing, about how big houses are a burden at your age. The way my name had slowly disappeared from conversations about the future, replaced by phrases like we've already planned or it's taken care of. I remembered the afternoon Richard had asked me, almost gently, to sign a few documents, just in case something ever happens. He'd laughed when I hesitated, kissed my forehead, and said, "Alina, you've always trusted me. Why stop now?" And I had signed, because trust, once practiced long enough, becomes muscle memory. Sitting at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, I opened the drawer where we kept our important papers. I wasn't panicking. Panic would have meant shock. This was different. This was awareness. I didn't know exactly what had been done yet, but I knew enough to understand why it had been done. People don't sideline a woman like me by accident. They do it because they believe she won't notice until it's too late, or worse, that she'll notice and still stay quiet. I pulled out bank statements, old insurance policies, folders I hadn't opened in years because I'd been told I didn't need to. And with every page I turned, the picture sharpened. Accounts restructured. Beneficiaries adjusted. Assets quietly repositioned under the guise of efficiency. Nothing illegal, at least not on the surface. Just calculated. Just patient. Just done with the confidence of people who believe they are smarter than you. What hurt most wasn't the money, or even the deception. It was the realization that my loyalty had been used as a tool against me, that my age had been factored into their timing, that somewhere along the line, the woman who carried everyone else through hard years had been reclassified as an obstacle instead of a partner. I thought about the countless dinners I'd cooked while listening to other people's ambitions, the times I'd delayed my own plans because someone else's seemed more urgent. I had mistaken being needed for being valued. And now, as the truth settled in my chest, I understood something essential. They hadn't underestimated my intelligence. They had underestimated my willingness to change. Because the moment you stop asking, why would they do this to me, and start asking, how did they expect me to respond, the balance of power quietly begins to shift. I closed the drawer, finally took a sip of my cold coffee, and allowed myself one honest thought, steady and unafraid. They think this story is already written. And that was the exact moment I decided to become the author instead of the footnote. By that evening, I still hadn't said a word to anyone. Not to Richard, not to my daughter, not even to the friend who called to chat about nothing in particular. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be more powerful than confrontation, and I needed that space to think clearly. I went for a walk around the neighborhood just as the sun began to dip, the streets washed in that soft, golden light that makes everything look kinder than it really is. I passed houses I'd watched fill and empty over the years, families come and go, marriages begin and quietly dissolve. I realized how often women like me become invisible not because we disappear, but because people stop imagining we might still act. They assume time has dulled us, softened us, made us grateful for whatever scraps of relevance were handed. As I walked, memories surfaced, not dramatic ones, just small, telling details. Richard correcting me in front of the financial advisor with a laugh. She doesn't worry about numbers anymore. My daughter joking that I should just relax and enjoy retirement when I mentioned consulting part-time. Each moment had seemed harmless on its own, even affectionate. But strung together, they told a very different story. Decisions were being made around me, not with me. By the time I reached the park at the end of the block, my sadness had crystallized into something steadier, sharper. I sat on a bench and watched a young woman push a stroller, phone pressed to her ear, negotiating something urgent with someone who couldn't see her face. I wondered if she knew how early it starts, this quiet negotiation for space, for authority, for the right to be taken seriously. I wondered if she would one day sit where I was sitting, replaying years of small concessions she thought were kindness. And that's when it clicked. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was structural. It relied on my predictability, on the assumption that I would prioritize harmony over truth, family over self, peace over fairness. They weren't counting on anger, and they certainly weren't counting on revenge. They were counting on fatigue, on me deciding it was all too much trouble to undo. I stood up then, feeling strangely calm, and headed home with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I didn't yet know what I would do or how far I would go, but I knew this much with absolute certainty. Whatever came next would not be loud, reckless, or emotional. It would be precise, thought through, and devastating in the quiet way only a woman who has finally stopped explaining herself can be. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, not because the situation had resolved, but because my mind had finally stopped running in circles. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly justifying your existence to people who benefit from your doubt, and once you decide to stop doing that, something inside you settles. I woke early before the alarm and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching steam curl upward like a quiet signal that the day was beginning on my terms. I pulled out a yellow legal pad, the same kind I'd used for decades when organizing household budgets, school schedules, and later business notes when I worked in operations, and I began to write. Not emotionally, not angrily, but methodically. Names, dates, conversations I remembered clearly. Financial decisions that had been presented to me as already handled. Accounts I'd been gently discouraged from reviewing myself. I wasn't creating a list to accuse anyone. I was creating a map, and maps are tools for people who intend to move. As I wrote, patterns emerged that I hadn't wanted to see before. The slow transfer of authority masked as care. The way questions about my finances were deflected with jokes. The subtle rewriting of my role from contributor to dependent. None of it happened overnight, which is why it worked. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't usually arrive screaming. It arrives smiling, carrying groceries, offering to take that off your plate. By mid-morning, the page was full, and for the first time I felt something close to anticipation. Not fear of what I might uncover, but curiosity about how much control I still had. I made a few phone calls, nothing dramatic, just confirmations, appointments, requests for documents. Each person I spoke to treated me with a respect I hadn't felt in a long time, and I wondered how much of that came from my tone alone. Confidence has a frequency people respond to, even when they don't know why. By the time the sun was high, I understood that what I was doing wasn't retaliation in the traditional sense. It wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about reclaiming authorship of a story that had quietly been rewritten without my consent. And once you realize someone else has been holding the pen, the only real revenge is taking it back and finishing the story yourself. By the afternoon, everything I'd written that morning began to feel less like preparation and more like inevitability. I wasn't rushing, and that was important. People assume revenge has to be swift to be effective, but in reality, the most lasting consequences are built slowly, layer by layer, until there's nothing impulsive left to criticize. I drove across town to the bank branch I'd used for years, the one where I used to let other people speak for me because it seemed easier that way. This time, I walked in alone, shoulders back, paperwork neatly organized in my bag. The young man at the front desk offered me water, called me ma'am with a hint of deference, and within minutes I was seated across from a senior advisor. I watched carefully as his posture shifted the moment I asked the right questions, the kind that signaled I understood exactly what I was looking at. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, just clarity. Accounts were reviewed, access permissions explained, old authorizations quietly revoked. Nothing dramatic happened in that office, yet when I stood to leave, I knew something fundamental had changed. Outside, the air felt lighter, almost sharp, as if the world had tilted just enough to remind me I was still capable of moving through it with authority. On the drive home, I thought about how often women are taught that control must be obvious to be real, that power looks like dominance, not restraint. But restraint, when chosen freely, is a form of power too. I wasn't taking anything away yet. I was simply ensuring that no one could take from me again without my consent. That distinction mattered. Back at home, I filed the documents carefully, labeling folders the way I always had, calm and precise. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt organized. And for someone who had spent years being underestimated, that was the most dangerous state of mind of all. That evening, as the light softened and the house settled into its familiar creaks, I allowed myself a moment to sit without distraction, something I hadn't done in years. The television stayed off, my phone face down on the table, the silence intentional rather than accidental. In that quiet, patterns became clearer. I replayed conversations from the past, not with bitterness, but with a kind of forensic calm, noticing where assumptions had been made, where my silence had been interpreted as consent, where my generosity had quietly rewritten itself into expectation. It wasn't painful in the way regret usually is, it was instructive. I realized how often I had been framed as dependable rather than decisive, useful rather than respected. Those labels don't arrive overnight. They accumulate through small moments, through choosing peace over clarity one too many times. I stood and walked through each room, touching the edges of furniture, shelves, picture frames, grounding myself in what was actually mine. Ownership, I was learning, isn't just legal or financial. It's psychological. It's the moment you stop asking for permission to protect yourself. Later, I opened my notebook and began writing, not plans, not letters, just observations. Names, dates, patterns, nothing emotional, nothing dramatic. Anyone reading it would have thought it was mundane, even boring. But that was the point. This wasn't a performance. It was the quiet architecture of consequence. Outside, a neighbor's porch light flicked on, and somewhere a car door slammed. Life moved on, unaware that a line had been crossed internally and could not be uncrossed. I closed the notebook, set it carefully in the drawer, and for the first time in a long while, slept without rehearsing explanations in my head. Whatever came next would meet a version of me that no longer needed to justify her boundaries, and that, I knew, was where the balance of power truly began to shift. By the time morning came, I felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. The kind of clarity that doesn't announce itself with confidence but settles in like a decision already made. I moved through my routine with deliberate steadiness, brewing coffee, opening the blinds, letting the day reveal itself without rushing to meet it. There were messages on my phone I didn't open right away, names I recognized, tones I could already predict. Once that anticipation would have tightened my chest, pulled me into a familiar cycle of explaining, softening, accommodating. This time it didn't. I took my coffee to the window and watched a woman across the street load groceries into her trunk, methodical and unbothered. It struck me how rarely we recognize quiet strength because it doesn't demand attention. After breakfast, I made a list, not of grievances, but of non-negotiables. What I would no longer tolerate. What access would now require. What generosity, if given again, would be clearly defined. There was no anger in it, only resolve. I understood then that revenge doesn't always arrive as confrontation or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives as withdrawal, as restructuring, as a life that no longer orbits those who assumed it always would. Later that afternoon, I finally returned a call, my voice calm, measured, almost distant. I said very little, and in that restraint I felt the imbalance shift. Silence, when chosen rather than endured, carries weight. When the call ended, I didn't replay it. I didn't analyze what I could have said differently. I simply set the phone down and went back to my day, aware that something fundamental had changed, not in them, but in me. And that was enough to alter the entire outcome. The shift didn't announce itself with drama, but I could feel it in the way people suddenly hesitated around me, like they sensed an unseen boundary they hadn't noticed before. That afternoon, I met someone who had known me for years, someone who used to speak over me without realizing it. And for the first time, they paused, actually waited for me to finish a sentence. It wasn't respect born from fear or apology, it was recognition. And recognition, once earned, is hard to take back. I realized then that my quiet reorientation had already begun to ripple outward, not because I demanded anything, but because I had changed how I occupied space. I no longer leaned in when someone dismissed my point. I no longer filled silences meant to pressure me into agreement. I let people sit with their assumptions, with their discomfort, with the realization that I was no longer the easiest person in the room to maneuver. Back home, I reorganized a drawer that had been chaotic for years. Old documents, keys whose locks I no longer remembered, receipts from lives already lived. As I sorted, I thought about how often women are told to let things go, as if release is always virtuous and holding on is always bitterness. But sometimes holding on isn't about resentment, it's about memory, about refusing to let your story be rewritten by people who benefit from your forgetfulness. I kept what mattered, discarded what didn't, and close the drawer with a quiet sense of completion. That night, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she was harder or colder, but because she was finally centered. And I understood something then that I wish I'd learned sooner. The most unsettling revenge isn't when people see you angry. It's when they see you unmoved, unavailable, and entirely out of reach. The consequences arrived gradually, almost politely, the way real accountability usually does. There were subtle shifts first, missed calls that didn't get returned, invitations that stopped coming, conversations that felt strangely one-sided because I was no longer carrying them. People who once relied on my predictability seemed unsure of how to approach me now, as if the rules had changed without notice. And in a way, they had. I noticed it most in the small moments. The way a suggestion I made was suddenly taken seriously. The way my absence from a discussion created a pause instead of relief. There's a quiet power in becoming non-essential to those who assumed you always would be. It forces them to confront what they actually valued about you, your presence, or your compliance. One evening, as I sat alone with a book I'd been meaning to finish for years, I realized I hadn't thought about proving anything all day. That, more than anything, felt like victory, not because I had won, but because I had stepped out of a game I was never meant to play. I had reclaimed time, energy, and attention, resources far more precious than arguments or apologies. Whatever narrative they told themselves now was no longer my responsibility to manage or correct. I had become something quietly inconvenient to manipulate, self-directed. And once a woman reaches that point, the outcome is already decided. By the end of it all, there was no dramatic confrontation, no final speech that left anyone stunned into silence, and that was exactly the point. My revenge was never about spectacle. It was about permanence. I didn't need them to admit they were wrong or to apologize in a way that sounded convincing. I needed something far simpler and far more powerful, to live in a way that no longer required their approval, attention, or validation. And I did. I rebuilt my life quietly, intentionally, with boundaries so clear they didn't need defending. The people who once underestimated me now spoke about me differently, cautiously, as if aware they had miscalculated something they couldn't undo. That was their burden, not mine. When I look back now, I don't feel bitterness. I feel relief. Relief that I listened to the moment inside me that said enough. Relief that I chose myself without asking permission. And if you're listening to this and you've ever felt invisible, taken for granted, or quietly betrayed by people who assumed you would always stay small, I want you to know this. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands up and walks away. If something in this story felt familiar, share your experience in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more real, powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Don't underestimate the power of women. And Merry Christmas.